Hello. All right. Apologies for that. Selamat pagi dan selamat datang, ladies and gentlemen, Bapak-Bapak dan Ibu-Ibu, distinguished panelists and guests here with us today. On behalf of the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs and the World Bank, a very warm welcome to the grand launch of the Indonesia Non-Tarif Measures database, enhancing industrial competitiveness and boosting export performance. My name is Sheila Lakatosh, and it is my pleasure to be the moderator today. I would like to welcome you for joining us here in person at the Graha Sabala Hall, and to those connected virtually. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. For those of you joining us virtually, you may want to explore options for simultaneous interpretation as well as sign language interpretation, which should be now available on your screens. While for participants here at the Graha Sawala Hall, interpretation devices are also available at the registration table in case you may need it. Second, we would like to give you the opportunity to ask questions to the distinguished panelists that are here with us today. And to do so, please use the Slido link that should appear behind me on the screen today. So either the Slido link, the QR code that is here to please submit your questions that will be later addressed by the panelists. And allow me to quickly start with a brief rundown of our program today. First, we will commence with opening remarks by Bapak Habib Rab, Acting Country Director and Lead Economist for Indonesia and Timor-Leste at the World Bank. This will be followed by a keynote speech by Bapak Ferry Irawan, Acting Deputy for Macroeconomics and Finance at the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. Next, we will continue with a presentation about the Indonesia NTM database by Ibu Angela Monfaucon, economist at the World Bank. And finally, we have an exciting panel discussion planned, and we are joined here by our distinguished panelists, Ibu Laxmi Kusumawati, Acting Director of Trade, Investment and International Economic Cooperation at Bappenas. Welcome, Ibu Laxmi. Bapak Iskandar Panjaitan, head of the Export, Import and Trade Security Center at the Ministry of Trade. Thank you for joining us, Bapak Iskandar. Third, Bapak Ralph Peters, Chief of the Trade Analysis Branch, Division of International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD. Thank you, Bapak Ralph, for joining us all the way from Geneva today. Bapak Kiki Wariko, Senior Economist at the Faculty of Economics and Business at the University of Indonesia. Thank you so much for joining us, Bapak Kiki. And last but not least, Bapak Massimiliano Cali, Senior Economist at the World Bank. Thank you, Bapak Massimiliano, for coming all the way from Tunisia to be with us today. This session of the panel discussion will be moderated by Ibu Tasya Paulin, Associate Policy Analyst, Monetary and External Sector at the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs. And now, without any further ado, allow me to invite Bapak Habib Rab, Acting Country Director and Lead Economist at the World Bank, to give his introductory remarks. The floor is yours, Bapak Habib.
Gosh, that's such a big picture. It's very scary. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi. It's a really great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of the World Bank Non-Tariff Measure database. We are extremely pleased to be co-organizing this event together with the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs. So let me start by acknowledging our distinguished speakers. Our dear friend Pa Ferry Irawan, Acting Deputy Minister for Macroeconomics and Financial Coordination at the CMEA, Ibu Lakshmi Kusumawati, Acting Director of Trade, Investment and International Economic Cooperation at Bapenas, Pak Iskandar Panjaitan, Head of the Export and Import and Trade Security Center at the Ministry of Trade, Pa Ralph Peters, the head of the chief of the Trade Analysis Branch at UNCTAD, our dear friend Pa Kiki Veriko, senior economist at LPMOE and also advisor to Ibu Sri Mulyani, and of course our very own Pa Massimiliano Kali, who's here from Tunisia. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, non-tariff measures have become increasingly popular in recent years, and for good reasons. They are, an important policy measures to address issues around food security, health safety, consumer protection. But on the flip side, they even when unintended, can also impose costs both on firms, but also ultimately on consumers. So to better understand some of these costs relative to their benefits, we work together with the Indonesian authorities to compile and analyze data on non-tariff measures. And this has culminated, in the first detailed time series NTM database for Indonesia going back all the way to 2008. And the data uses very disaggregated NTM classification and builds on the existing data set built by UNCTAD and the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. And the data provides monthly and highly disaggregated product and NTM classification level data and is updated every month. What is special, I think, about
recording in progress.
What you will see today is that it enhances some of the earlier data efforts that were conducted for non-tariff measures, and it enhances it in three ways. The first is that the data set is time varying, so we can monitor the changes on these NTMs over time, rather than just having a snapshot at any given point in time. Secondly, the data that is collected is monthly, so it's slightly higher frequency than we have seen before. And this is important because NTMs change quite frequently, so we get a more accurate picture of the changes. And then the third is that it is an improvement in terms of inclusion of a broader variety of sources, so we can identify NTMs that were previously undetected. Now, all this data has enabled us to already conduct some important policy-relevant analysis. I'll mention three in particular. One which enabled us to identify specific NTM measures, four in particular, that impact on the competitiveness of firms in Indonesia, the competitiveness in export markets, their ability to survive in export markets as well. The second is that the research has shown how NTMs can help to facilitate green trade. Eliminating or modifying a number of NTMs can play a crucial role in supporting international green competitiveness. And lastly, due to the updated nature of the data, we have also been able to show that products and firms that face certain NTMs were less resilient during the COVID-19 shock. I wanted to make one's personal reflection as a bit of an outsider from observing this process and the team that has been working on the NTM data set and the subsequent analysis, which is that I found this to be really the best practice in terms of evidence-based policy advice. And I say this for several reasons. The first is that I think that the research questions that were posed were very specific and actionable in terms of reforms. The second, I think, is that that the teams have applied very sophisticated approaches to illustrate the impacts of those reforms. And in doing so, it has engaged the technical counterparts in explaining how the data was compiled, how the analysis was also undertaken, so that the government itself can take forward some of this analysis going forward. I should also say that the results were presented to policy makers and also validated through extensive consultations with the private sectors. And all of this, I think, would not have been possible without excellent collaboration with the Indonesian authorities, of course, with the CMEA, but also the Customs Department, Ministry of Finance, and many others. And I also wanted to briefly acknowledge, and I will ask them, embarrass them slightly by asking them to stand up, to thank the team that has been responsible in leading this effort. So Angela Mofokon, Bayu Agnimaruto, Jana Silbering, Ibu Agnesia Hasmand, Pa Mohammed Pasha, Ibu Sheila Lakatosh, and our very own Uncle Max Kali. I call him Uncle because he is the gray-haired gentleman who's been spearheading a lot of these efforts over the last few years before he departed to the Tunisian shores. So the creation of this, data, as I said, is a really great example of the successful collaboration between the bank, the government counterparts, external entities, the UNCTAD area, and others. And we really look forward to hearing from our panelists, Pa Ralph, Pa Max, Pa Kiki, Pa Iskandar, and Ibu Lakshmi. So I hope you will enjoy today's sessions, and I look forward to the discussion. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you very much, Pa Habib, for delivering these introductory remarks and your valuable insights. I think it's safe to say that your support throughout this process has been extremely valuable, and this would have probably not happened if we don't have your support. So thank you so much for that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Bapak-bapak dan Ibu-ibu, next on our agenda is a keynote speech by Bapak Ferry Irawan, Acting Deputy for Macroeconomics and Finance at the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs. Good morning, Bapak Ferry. The stage is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Bu Sila, terima kasih for very nice introduction, Bu Sila. Yang saya hormati, Pak Habib, Economist for Indonesia and Timor-Leste. Pak Edwin Manangsang, thank you for coming, Pak, for this thing for me, and I think for also government is very important. All panelists, Pak Ralph, welcome to Jakarta, Pak Ralph, from a long way from Geneva. My colleague, Pak Max. Apa kabar, Pak Max? Long time no see, Pak Max. Pak Kiki, from UI, terima kasih Pak Kiki. Pak Iskandar dari Kementerian Perdagangan, thank you also for coming in this session. Bu Lakshmi, my colleague and also my important counterpart from Bappenas, thank you for coming. All participants, again, thank you very much for attending this session and discussion. First of all, of course, let us give thanks to Tuhan Yang Maha Esa. With His grace and permission, we are gathered here today to participate in what we call the grand launching of Indonesia'S Non-Tarif Measures database. And we also attach with the several after that, which is enhancing industrial competitiveness and boosting export performance. So we touch this two group together. So database for us, for me, is an instrument, to know about the policy that we already put in place in our economy. And of course, this instrument can be used to achieve one of the important goal of the government, which is the enhancing industrial competitiveness and also the boosting export performance. I hope that this event can become a product forum for discussing and constructing various policies, especially how to use data of Indonesian NTM as a strong evidence in the formulation of appropriate policies. Again, we test this NTM with with other word like the formulation of appropriate policies. So in government, of course, we assess the economic and then we identify also the development, the risk, the challenge, and after that, of course, what will be the next after we identify this condition and also the challenge. To identify this right challenge and the right formulation, of course, we need the data. That's why, again, this session for me and also I hope for the government and the CMS especially is very important. Ladies and gentlemen, although the slowdown of economic growth will still occur, the world continuity situation has shown sign of improvement and the probability of the recession continues to decrease. Optimism also emerged from the China. China is very important because this is our major counterpart, our major trading partners, which has reopened its border. So that is expected to be a stimulus amid the various existing risks. So a few months ago, I think all the media, all the discussion, we raised what we call maybe the stagflation risk or the recession, and of course, it's also highlight to the government this issue. Several discussion or curiosity from the reporter always mentioned about what will be the probability of recession in Indonesian case. But since we some new release publication from the World Bank, from the IMF, I think right now the tone is for me is quite positive from the previous publication. But of course, the World Bank and also the IMF also mentioned there is a positive one, but also still identify the risk. That's why all the measures, all the policies should be in place so we can anticipate all the possible condition to give a good response on the policy. On the Indonesian side, I think the economic activities also remain strong despite global condition that we already discussed previous. For example, on the BPS just released the indicator of our economic growth. Our overall 2022 economic growth is quite strong, 5.3%. Of course, we aware and also we try to anticipate all the possibility of the current global situation. For 2023, we still expect that the government still can achieve this 5.3% target, but of course, its target will achieve with the several policies. So this also right now the development of policy or the several measures put in place to make sure that this 5% can be achieved. The government also continues to strive the accelerate of process national economic recovery and boosting economic growth. Constructive efforts were made through the job creation law. Now it become the job creation in lieu of the law, or what we call Perpu. The government will continue to formulate appropriate strategies and policies so that Indonesia can optimally achieve its potential, especially amid the global economic condition and that are still volatile. Increasing competitiveness to support domestic resilience and strengthen national export is one of the main strategies. Right now, regarding the policy, of course, we design the short-term policy to achieve the short-term economic growth target. But of course, we also aware of the structural issue of our economy. So that's why we also not forget about the long-term perspective of our economy. So right now, the structural reform, I think one of the key measures or one of the key word that we always mention from our higher leader, the president, of course, in CMA office, Pak Menko. And from quoting from the World Bank Indonesian Economic Prospect report on December 2022, foreign direct investment has been responding positively to the reform. Looking ahead, complementary reform under the purpose of job creation with further trade reform could result in larger multiplier effect on investment and growth. In the medium to long term, economic transformation policies and boosting economic growth are expected to create more sustainable economic growth. I think the economists who usually calculate the output or prospect of economic growth is also mentioned about the CI, G, X, min, M, etc. For Indonesia right now, we are majorly source of growth is coming from the consumption. But of course, we know that the key for higher and more sustainable economic growth is coming from first investment and then export. So that's why again, this is become this session or this event is, I think, it's very important on putting on that perspective, investment and export. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, international trade is one of the main engine driving the wheel of the Indonesian economy. In effect, when the pandemic hit, the Indonesian export managed to grow high so that they become the main pillar of economic growth, while other engines were still on the recovery process. 5.3% that we achieved last year, I think, as we know, and I think we all agree, is majorly coming from the export. So export in 2022 is a backbone of our economic growth. In an interconnected world, the production of final product involve various companies in various countries of the world. This is what is known as the global value chain. For this reason, apart from the internal domestic factor, Indonesia export also need assistance from abroad, particularly the availability of the quality of material, so that they can produce finished good with more added value to be marketed domestically and of course exported. So I think this interconnection is important. So any measures, any policy that increasing the interconnectedness, I think is also important to make sure that the export or economy is still growing. One of strategies to encourage export growth is to ensure the Indonesian non-tariff measures policies, as I think it's already mentioned with Pak Habib. NTM are often used to achieve this public policy goal, like the food safety, consumer protection, and often used to achieve other issues like environmental protection. For this reason, I agree with Pak Habib that we should know the implication of this policy for national development, the national economic development. So the cost of the benefit, the cost and the benefit of this policy, I think is very important to make sure that all the policy that we use as NTM as an instrument is a net positive benefit effect to our economy. The MTM data is the result of the long-term collaboration between the World Bank and the government of Indonesia as one of the effort to encourage improvement in various macroeconomic aspects. Regarding the development of this data, I think I remember Pak Habib, Bu Sila, Bu Angela, our office and with collaborating with World Bank have started working together since 2021, which was then follow up with the concrete step to conduct to joint workshop on NTM data measurement in June 2022. So first we discussed with Bu Angela, Bu Sila, but what is NTM? What the detail of NTM? What the instrument that in place when we talking about the NTM? So after we identify the instrument and we identify what the related ministry that have a link with these issues, and then we discuss with the World Bank and we arrange, I remember the workshop Bu Sila, Bu Angela Pak Habib in the World Bank office, and we also invite all the relevant ministries. I mentioned that, I remember that in the room, in the World Bank room, we invite the relevant ministries, Minister of Trade, Minister of Finance, Minister of Industry, Minister of National Development Planning, and of course the Financial System Stability Committee. And thanks to this strong cooperation, I think one of the key policy in the job creation law in 2021 is notably the issue of precedent inspection, one of the key measurement in the NTM. So I think in the future, I'm expecting this is not the end collaboration, Pak Habib, Bu Sila, Bu Angela. I think it is just the start. For the next collaboration, our office, the government with the World Bank, and thanks also for inviting a colleague from UN UNCTAD, Pak Ralph. I think also we can develop this as a network to discussing about NTM and of course the impact to the topic of NTM and impact to the economy. I hope the ongoing dialogue and the data will continue to help identify measure of the policy needs to be improved or reformed. We also hope this data set will be useful reference in discussing and policy analysis in Indonesia. The collaboration between the World Bank and the government of Indonesia elaborating this data set has been very fruitful experience that we hope to maintain in the future. I just read, this is just teaser for our next discussion. I just saw what the will present with Bu Angela. Just to give you a teaser, I think the database is quite detailed. It composed like I just read with your permission ya Bu Angela ya. Bapak Ibu sekalian nih terus terang. Jadi kami dorong untuk kita betul-betul baca dan pelajari dari dataset ini gitu ya. Karena betul-betul sangat detail. Misalnya ada 89 individual NTMs with 652 total regulation and then 168 months, like Pak Habib mentioned, is quite long time series. And there's also 5,194 product affected per month by at least one NTM, and then 59% import value affected per month. I think this quite detail both on the cross country, the cross section analysis and of course the time series analysis. So I really encourage colleague from relevant ministry, especially my team, Bu Angela, Bu Sila, Pak Habib, to see detail on this database, and of course the most important is how to utilize the data. Just mentioned in Bu Angela presentation, we can use this data usage for this database indicator of the incident of MTM. The second one about the indicator of the cost of the NTM. The third one is identify the burdensome of the NTMs. And the fourth, because we just there's some specific event in 2022 and 2021, there's also analyzing the effect of the NTM during the COVID-19. The last one is, I think for me personal, is the fifth one is very important, simulating the impact of MTM reform. So I think we can know the cost and benefit of the NTM. Of course, as a policymaker, we expect that this instrument, when we introduce to our economy, can have the positive net impact. So the export is growing, the competitive is increasing, and then of course we expect that our economic growth is higher and higher for the growing. I think I will stop here, not to make longer discussion, and we can, enjoying the next panel discussion, and we will start to elaborating this database from Bu Angela. I think mudah-mudahan diskusinya bisa sangat proaktif, produktif gitu ya. Karena sekali lagi ini sangat buat saya pribadi dan mungkin juga tadi sekali lagi buat the government and especially in our office, it's sangat bermanfaat. Mungkin cukup dari kami. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Ferry, for your valuable insight and for delivering this keynote speech. I find that you have raised several crucial issues, positioning today's discussion in short-term, medium, and also long-term structural perspectives for the importance of this topic for, issues such as industrial competitiveness and boosting export performance, which we hope that maybe the panel discussion will have time to go more deeply into some of these really crucial issues. And wanted to also say a big appreciation for the citation from the Indonesia Economic Prospects December 2022 version. Actually, for those of you that don't know, this was entitled Trade for Growth and Economic Transformation, and the issue of NTMs and how is it that we can potentially move forward with this agenda was a big part of the discussion in that particular IEP. Now, without further ado, moving on to the next agenda item for today's discussion, we have a presentation on the Indonesia NTM database by Ibu Angela Monfocon, economist at the World Bank. Ibu Angela, the floor is yours.
Every day, Indonesian households consume thousands of products. And Indonesian firms use thousands of inputs to produce. Non-tariff measures, or NTMs, are policy measures that aim to ensure that these products and inputs are safe, healthy, they respect the environment, and do not pose other types of risk. Even as these measures aim to protect all Indonesians, they can also affect the economy. Complying with these measures can be costly, so they can result in higher prices for consumers and they can make companies less internationally competitive. For example, the World Bank estimates that special packaging requirements on leather, textiles, and apparel products increase the cost of these products in Indonesia by 26%. So the government needs to design NTMs that achieve their objectives without imposing excessive economic costs. For that, governments need comprehensive and up-to-date data. As part of its engagement with the Indonesian government, the World Bank has produced this type of data on non-tariff measures for Indonesia. This is the most comprehensive data on NTMs available in any country worldwide. It gives information on all NTMs applied by Indonesia every month on every product, and it is updated every year. The data allows the government, researchers, NGOs, and the general public to know what NTMs are applied to what products and at what costs. This can help design better NTMs for the need of the Indonesian people and the economy. The dataset, along with its manual and usage examples, are available on the World Bank Development Data Hub, the UNCTAD Trade Analysis Information System trains, and on the World Integrated Trade Solution.
Next slide, please. So this is a quick outline of the presentation. So we are going to try to explain why we think that this data is important, and then briefly touch upon how this collaboration with the government of Indonesia improved the existing data, because of course we built on data that already existed by the good work done by ANKTAD and DERIA. And then briefly show how can you as users, government policymakers or researchers utilize this data. And I think the panel discussion will also sort of touch more on that. And then where do we go from here? Because this launch should be just a start of this important discussion. Next slide, please. So, as we have already heard from the many good discussions today, non-tariff measures, even as they are impacting businesses and people and trying to ensure these important policies, they can affect trade. And they can cause distortions and they can have costs, even when this is not the intent of these policies. So there are several ways that non-tariff measures can do this. And one of the main ones, next slide, please. One of the main ones that this can happen is through, for example, administrative burdens. So if it's very difficult or you need lots of paperwork to comply with the measure, it can be quite difficult. Or if it's not very clear what is the information or it's not very transparent and maybe companies don't really know what am I supposed to do to make sure that I comply with this, that could cause costs as well. Sometimes also if there is a lack of recognition. So maybe I would like to export to another country, but the standards there and the standards here are very different and we do not recognize the standards in different countries. This can impose costs, especially as Ferry alluded to in our world of global value chains. So also, if it just takes a long time to sort of comply with the measures, sometimes, as you've seen, the objectives are very different. One ministry might be concerned with the environment, so they'll put a regulation for that. Another ministry is concerned with health, and they may put a regulation for that. So you may have lots of different institutions and agencies putting regulations that may affect a few traded goods. So it can be quite difficult for companies to follow what is going on. Next slide. So in order to ensure that these non-tariff measures achieve their goals without imposing unnecessarily high costs, they need to be properly designed. So that means that it's important to make sure that non-tariff measures comply with, sort of international standards and commitments. They are transparent. They are not restrictive to trade. They do not discriminate against imports. And most importantly, they can be reviewed periodically and monitored and assessed. So these are really important. It's not only to say, oh, look, this is how many NTMs there are in this month or that month, but to also assess them and to do it in a more periodic and systematic way. But in order to do any of this, it's important to have data, and for that data to be as updated as possible and as comprehensive as possible. So to facilitate this, the World Bank and the government of Indonesia have created the first comprehensive time series database of non-tariff measures. This will enable that this assessment of NTMs can help identify reforms that can feed into the objectives of export growth, international competitiveness, and even attracting investment. So this data is the first data that provides information on specific NTMs that are applied each product on every month, and it starts from 2008 January, and as of the release today, goes up to December 2021. And it is now available, so you can access it soon after this meeting from these 3 different websites, including on the UNCTAD Trains, which is a global repository on data on non-tariff measures. Next slide, please. So Paferi already alluded to all these wonderful numbers, so I don't have to say them all over again. But this is just a snapshot of some of the information that is contained in this data. Notably that, there's quite a lot of products that are affected and represents about 60%, nearly 60% of traded value is affected by at least one non-tariff measure. Next slide. So a little bit of how did this data come to be? So there's 4 main ways that we will touch on into here that will highlight how this data sort of improved on the existing data that UNCTAD and ERIA had already collected for Indonesia. While maintaining the very wonderful and detailed guidelines that exist that are provided by UNCTAD on how non-tariff measures data should be collected and coded. So these are that we tried to use a broader sources of data. We make the data time varying, as already been described. It's at a higher frequency, but also in some cases it becomes necessary to customize measures to the Indonesian context. So on the first point that the data is time varying and of a higher frequency, we can see that non-tariff measures can change quite rapidly. So the chart on the left is showing changes on a month-by-month basis on in 3 years for a specific measure that already Paferi mentioned in pre-shipment inspections. So we can see that significant drop in November 2021 refers to, again, Paferi, who alluded to the policies that the government put in place in 2021. But here it is to illustrate that these changes can happen quite frequently, even within the year. And so this higher frequency data, higher time frequency of the data sort of helps to track that. And the chart on the right is number of COVID-19 related changes in NTM. So when the pandemic happened, many governments put in place regulations to address different needs. So these were just some of the regulations in our data that we were able to tag based on what they said, and that they were applied to trade, but in response to COVID-19 for one reason or the other. But we can again see that high frequently changing number month on month, which sort of helps track when the data is at a high frequency. On the second point is on using a broader source base. So of course, the main source of data, the guidelines suggest that non-tariff measures have to be issued by, of course, an authority, a government authority. So the repositories of line ministries become very important in the collection of data. But we also use 2 other sources of data that help us to have sort of a backward and more historical list of regulations. This includes the Hukuman Online, but also the government Ministry of Law and Human Rights that have these regulations there. So by using all of these sources, we are able to sort of track backwards and forward. And this is very important because, as we discussed earlier, non-tariff measures are addressing many different objectives, meaning several different ministries are putting them in place. So this is an attempt to try to put all of it in one place, and something that can be sort of more easily facilitate tracking by the different ministries. So on the left side, the LMs line is just the total number of ministry each year. And we can see that different ministries are responsible for a different number of non-tariff measures in Indonesia. And this changes year after year, depending on different objectives that the government might have. Next slide. The third way that we try to enhance this data is more regular updates. So this data so far has been updated every year. And we see that when we update every year, again, we can more timely identify what is the policy landscape and the regulatory context when it comes to trade policy. So the chart here is just showing that with each update, we can see that different number of products have either been added, NTMs have been added to them or removed from them. So sometimes just the regulation alone does not really tell us whether or not, even if a regulation has been revoked, it may not mean that they have removed that measure. So sometimes there's an update or regulations are consolidated, whatever the case may be. But this frequent updates helps us to just track how products and measures are changing over time, which may or may not be related with less or more regulations, depending on what the regulations say. Next slide. And then the fourth main point that we'll highlight here is customization. So the UNCTAD guidelines provide us with a very comprehensive list of the types of non-tariff measures that exist. And I'm sure you will hear more on that from our panelists. But some of the regulations in Indonesia may have some added information that may not be very easily classified, but are related to a measure that is already existing in the international classification. So one of the things that this data set does in such a case is to identify what that measure is and then add this extra information that may be more relevant to the Indonesian context. The example you see on the screen has to do with export approval. So while we have a measure for export approvals in the list of non-tariff measures, there's an added requirement to get a recommendation letter for specific products. That's, if you want to trade in diamonds. And so we add this extra information in the data so that one can differentiate that, okay, for this product, a recommendation letter is needed, but for this product, you simply need to get an import approval. And that sort of helps to know, okay, what steps are needed to be taken for you to be able to trade in such a product. Next slide. So all of this information, what can we really do with this data? So here we highlight 5 ways, which again, thank you, Paferi, for giving a nice summary on how the data can be used. So if, after the event, when you go to the website or you download it, or you can play around with the visualizations on the website, what can you really learn from there? And then there's other things that can be done with additional steps and additional procedures that can help us learn more about non-tariff measures. Next slide. So the first one that we highlight is showing the indicators of non-tariff measures. So these are simply indicators that help us understand what is the share of products that are affected by either a specific measure or a general measure, or what is the share of traded value that helps us understand that are affected by non-tariff measures. So this does not tell us whether something is good or bad. It just tells us what share of trade is affected, which could be something that would be interesting to learn. So for example, on the left-hand side, the chart is showing by end use. So if it's more intermediate products that are affected, then maybe we could then take the next step to see, okay, is this a challenge or not? And then we could look a little bit further into that. So on the left-hand side, we can see, for example, that a larger share of intermediate products might be affected by a certification to national standards. And then the chart on the right, oh, we lost the slide. The chart on the right, could you go back, please? Is showing the share of products. So this is just counting the number of products as a share of all the products that exist are affected by import approvals. So this one is showing specific types of green goods and technologies. I think Pa Habib alluded to earlier about how this data can also help us, how Indonesia could enhance its green international competitiveness by ensuring access to green technologies that could feed into the green transition in the processes. Next slide. The second key indicators that the data can help us learn is the cost of non-tariff measures. So there's several ways to understand how costly a measure can be. One of the most standard systematic ways that we can do that is by using ad valorem equivalent. So this tells us, okay, the measure, it's a regulation on a piece of paper that explains what needs to be done if you want to trade in a specific product. But from that alone, it's not easy to quantify how that may or may not be costly. So this helps us to put a number to that and say, this measure has this tariff equivalent, because for tariffs, we know that, okay, 10% has to be paid or 12% has to be paid. We can do something similar with non-tariff measures with some additional steps. So this is an example of that has been done with this database, and it, for example, tells us that the cost of complying with certification requirement for renewable energy products that are imported to Indonesia is, for example, about 20% or so. So it helps us put a number to it. But to understand the caveat that even this may not necessarily mean, okay, we need to reform the measure, because a measure could be costly to comply with, but it may still be justified. So maybe it's very costly to comply with labeling requirements on pharmaceutical products, but that's probably, we still cannot risk that people, for example, import counterfeit medicine. So even AVEs alone can tell us the cost, but they still do not say this means that it needs to be reformed. All of that is to say that understanding non-tariff measures has to be a holistic exercise, and really knowing that, okay, they are costly, yes. They apply to many products, yes. Is the measure justified? Maybe. Can we achieve that policy goal with something less distortive, with something less costly? And then at that point, we can sort of try to decide, where do we go from here? Next slide. And so that takes me to the next point, where we then try to identify what are the most burdensome non-tariff measures in Indonesia that affect Indonesian companies. As you've heard the number already, there's over 89 measures in the data. So we try to follow this systematic way of identifying which ones are most costly and which ones are most burdensome and could be applied better, or that objective could be achieved with a different type of policy. So after attempting to do this, the World Bank identified 4 measures, which I think if you were at the Indonesian Economic Prospects, you must have heard about these already. And those are pre-shipment inspections, which of course have now decreased, restrictions on the port of entry, import approvals, and the mandatory certification with SNI. Next slide. So several analyses were done to sort of come to this conclusion, but to emphasize that all of these measures sort of help that holistic assessment. And we found that these 4 measures, for example, have a negative impact on exports. As Paferi mentioned, that in today's global value chains, importing and exporting go hand in hand. So even though we are showing these non-tariff measures in this particular case on imports, we found that actually they had a negative impact on export, meaning that reforming these measures could actually have a positive impact on Indonesia's export growth and a positive impact on the competitiveness of Indonesian companies. Next slide. And the fourth thing, which was also mentioned, was understanding the role of non-tariff measures during COVID-19. So, okay, there's a global shock that has happened. We want to understand how are companies coping? And if companies are facing non-tariff measures, is that making that coping mechanism even worse? So this data was used to understand that for Indonesia, to see companies that are involved in global value chains, GVC firms for Indonesia, how they fared if they faced port of entry restrictions. You will recall that during COVID, we had a lot of port congestions. And so we thought that this was quite a relevant measure to look at. And indeed, we did find that compared to companies that did not face those port of entry restrictions, global value firms involved in global value chains were more negatively affected. So this is also another way that this data has been used. Next slide. And finally, which is Paferi's favorite, is simulating the impact of reforms. Okay, so say we have gone through all this process, we've understood which ones are costly, we've understood that these ones are burdensome. Now we have decided maybe we need to reform some measures, or maybe we need to even eliminate some measures because maybe they are not really achieving our intended policy goal. What would be the impact of doing that reform or eliminating that measure? So this data, of course, with additional analytical steps can help us understand that in this example, after identifying those 4 burdensome measures, we were able to show that if reform took place on those 4 measures in the medium run, there would be a positive impact on the macroeconomy of Indonesia. Notably, even though these measures are on imports, we find that actually net exports would increase. So even though imports would increase, exports would increase even more. Notably as well is that investment would increase quite significantly because it makes Indonesia more internationally competitive. And companies will find that, okay, I can be in Indonesia and I can access the global markets. So this is really to show that this kind of analysis can really help inform evidence-based policy and help that when we are making the reforms, we are thinking about what are the potential consequences. On the right-hand side is a different simulation which looks at some measures that affect and how they could actually affect the prices of food. So here we can see that as an example, and we can see this port of entry is appearing again, but we have import approvals, pre-shipment inspections. But what this shows is that eliminating, for example, port of entry requirements would actually decrease the cost of food imported by 11.5%. Next slide. So this is a really brief presentation about this data set. But also released today is the sort of the manual that is behind this data that goes into a little bit more detail and that you will now be able to find online. Next slide. Go 2 slides before. We skipped a slide here. Okay, yes. So where do we go from here? So it's been said that today is just the beginning of this very important discussion. While this database is extensive and gives us good information, the data can help us identify a lot of different information and the cost of measures and also the incidence of measures. But the most important thing is to know that from the bigger picture, this can contribute to the export and investment promotion of Indonesia, promote the competitiveness of Indonesian firm, and really contribute to economic transformation and sustainable growth with everything that we have discussed. So our hope is that this data could facilitate more systematic and periodic reviews of non-tariff measures in Indonesia, so that we can timely identify which ones can be implemented better and which ones perhaps need to be eliminated and replaced with better policies. And the other thing is that we are hoping that by sharing this process, other countries can follow Indonesia's good example that Indonesia has set today in helping create similar databases for other countries as well. Terima kasih banyak. I'm going to stop here, and we really thank you for coming to this launch. You can get more information in the links that were shown in the video, and you will be able to access both the manual and the data from today going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Angela, for this excellent presentation and describing us all the great work that went into the construction of this great database, and also the potential work streams that we can undertake using it, and also making us think about the potential next steps. But now, before moving on to the next agenda item and picking up on Ibu Angela's personal experience on NTMs, I was wondering, who's ready for an NTM joke? See, I knew that there was going to be popular demand for this. And you know, as we were brainstorming with the team yesterday, we couldn't come up with anything good. We are economists, so we're a bit of a sad bunch. So this is why we turned to ChatGPT. You may have heard about this artificial intelligence chatbot that is useful for many different things, including telling NTM jokes. Now, most of the NTM jokes, I have to say, they are not suitable for being told in this particular event. So we had to censor a lot of the NTM jokes, but you can look into it yourself. You'll discover a lot of interesting ones. So first NTM joke. Why did the tariff break up with the non-tariff measure? And the answer is because the non-tariff measure was always putting up barriers. And the tariff was just not feeling the chemistry anymore. Chemistry as in SPS requirements. Second joke, please hang in there with me. Why did the chicken refuse to cross the border? Well, because it did not have the necessary phytosanitary requirements, and it was afraid of non-compliance with non-tariff measures. Okay, I'll stop there before you all decide to leave. But I can promise you one thing, that the next stage of our event is going to be much more interesting and funny than what my NTM jokes. Okay, so with that, allow us to move on with the next part of our event, and this is really what I would call the exciting part, and essentially it entails with us here together with our distinguished panelists to launch, symbolically push the NTM launch button, and thus making it available for all of us to use. So for this, allow me to please invite our distinguished panelists, together with Pa Habib, Pa Ferry, and Ibu Angela, to please come onto the stage and help us push this symbolic button that will launch the NTM database. Please, Bapa Ralph, Bapa Ferry, Bapa Habib, Bapa Iskandar, Bapa Kiki Verico. This is also in preparation for the next stage. Please, welcome to the stage. And Bapa Max, of course. Yes, please. And Papa Edwin, expert staff, please. Please. So this is in preparation for the virtual button. Let's all prepare to put our hands on the screen and move ahead with the launch. This is what all the grand part of the launch was all about. All right, I think we are slowly but surely ready. Ready? Steady, 4, 3, 2, 1. And a big round of applause to the team for their superhuman efforts that made this all happen. The data and all the accompanying materials are now publicly available for all of you to use. Thank you very much, everyone, for this really exciting launch. Now, allow me to invite our distinguished panelists to please take a seat. And Ibu Angela, thank you very much again for the excellent presentation. So this takes us to the panel discussion part of our event, and I will hand the floor over to Ibu Tasya Pauline, Associate Policy Analysis, Monetary and External Sector at the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs. Ibu Tasya and distinguished panelists, the floor is yours.
Please have a seat, Pak. Okay, thank you, Bu Sila, for making my task easier because you already invite all the panelists. Okay, as Pak Habib also feel a little bit weird with his photo, yeah. I think I also make a wrong decision to give this photo to the committee because I looked too serious in this because I thought that NTMs will be a very serious topic, so I have to give the serious photo. But then I see all the panelists. If maybe later you will see that the panelist photo is very look happy and relaxed. I think it's reflect that this discussion should be an exciting, or like even though that we know that NTMs will be a little bit complex, but we have to take this discussion to a more. Okay, I think I cannot make a better joke than Busila, and then I'll pass. Okay, thank you. Sorry for the introduction and too long. See, all look very happy over here while I look too serious, but okay, it's good. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here, and it's very honored to be have a discussion with this assemble of our panelists right here. I will not give a lot of introduction because Bu Angela already give a very comprehensive and wonderful presentation about what is this NTM's database. Right now, I will do my job and introduce first all the panelists that are joining with us today. The first one is we're very honored to have Pak Iskandar. Pak Iskandar Panjaitan. Pak Iskandar is, sorry, I have, my note is so big over here. Okay, Pak Iskandar, right now, Pak Iskandar is the head of Export and Import and Trade Security Center, Pak, in Ministry of Trade. Previously, Pak Iskandar was very, have a long responsibility in doing the service trade negotiation, Pak, in Ministry of Trade. He finished his education in the University of Tokyo Daigaku for the doctoral, and then the postdoc, and then the magister in also in University of Tokyo, ya Pak. Okay, welcome Pak Iskandar. And the next panelist, we're also happy to have Ibu Pandey Nyoman Laksmi Kusumawati. Bu Laksmi, should I call you Bu Laksmi? Okay, Bu Laksmi, she had her PhD in the Faculty of Art, University of Groningen, the Netherlands, with topic of dissertation is foreign direct investment, inclusive growth, and institution in Indonesia. And he also finished her double degree master program in economic in University Indonesia. Right now, she has two responsibility. But right now, you're definitive as a deputy director for conventional financial service and state-owned enterprise directorate in Bappenas, and also the acting director for trade, investment, and international economic cooperation. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe later. Okay. They also have a series of publication. One of it is the foreign direct investment, inclusive growth, and institution in Indonesia. And our next panelist I want to introduce is Ralph Peter. He come all the way from Geneva. Thank you so much. Ralph Peter is the chief of UNCTAD Trade Analyst Branch of the Division on International Trade and Commodities since February 2023. Before, he was chief of UNCTAD Trade Information Section and officer in charge of the Trade Analysis Branch Division on International Trade in Goods and Services and Commodities. He is in charge of the programs on trade policy research and trade control measure data, including the non-tariff measure. He also conducts analysis and implement technical cooperation projects on trade policy and development. For several years, he was in UNCTAD working closely with developing countries on the WTO Doha round negotiation on agriculture and non-agriculture market access. He was also chief technical advisor at the ILO for Trade and Employment. Before he joined the UN, he was project coordinator at the Center for European Economic Research and assistant professor of economics. He has a master's in mathematical economics and holds a PhD in economics. Thank you for joining us here, very far away from Geneva, Ralph. And our next panelist is Massimiliano Cali. Should I call you also Uncle Max? He is the senior country economist for the World Bank right now in Tunisia, where he leads the bank's macroeconomic, fiscal, and trade advisory and lending works. Previous position with the World Bank includes senior economist working on trade and competitiveness in Indonesia office and economist in the global trade team, where he focused on ways to use trade policy to reduce poverty and conflict. Prior to joining the bank, he served as an economic advisor to the Palestinian Ministry of National Economy, as a research fellow with the Overseas Development Institute, and as an economist with the Italian Embassy to Bolivia. He has published on trade and development, energy, immigration and urbanization, been published in peer-reviewed journals and books, and some of it has been featured in international and domestic media. He holds a PhD in economic geography from the London School of Economics. And the last but so very far from Liz, yeah, we have Pak Kiki Ferrico. Welcome, Pak Kiki. Pak Kiki Ferrico is a senior track assistant professor in international economics at the Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, and also a senior researcher of the LPMF EBUI. He has been working as a lecturer and researcher for more than 20 years. Pak Kiki holds a bachelor degree in economics from the University of Indonesia, an international master in regional integration from the University of Malaya and Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, a double degree, and a doctor of philosophy in international studies from the Waseda University. His research interests are in international trade at unilateral, bilateral, sub-regional, and mega-regional agreement, regional economic integration featuring ASEAN, Asia, and Indo-Pacific, as well as trade and foreign direct investment relation representing manufacturing production network, as well as Indonesia's macroeconomic, economic transformation, and economic development related topic. That's a very long topic, Pak. And right now, Pak Kiki Veriko is also the single author of a book entitled The Future of the ASEAN Economic Integration, published by Palgrave Maximilian, the UK in 2017, where he argues open and soft regionalism for the necessary condition of the ASEAN economic integration transformation. Okay, sorry for the very brief introduction, because Angela told me that we have to be briefly, because we don't have much time, but we want to have a very a good conversation or discussion with you. So I will start my first question maybe with Ibu Laksmi from Bapenas. Okay. So we will have a round of questions for each of you. Maybe you can answer maximal for 10 minutes. Before that, I will announce to the participant that you can ask a question through Slido. And for the online participant, you can also put your question on the Q&A section on the webinar. Okay, then my first question is for Bu Lasmia. We go to the topic of this ATM agenda, how to strike the right balance between achieving legitimate public goals, especially on consumer health and safety, environmental protection, food security, and also right now the energy, the zero emission, etc., and avoid to unnecessarily distort trade. And we want to see from the development planning perspective, Ibu, why are then the non-tariff measure will be important, and how will the NTMs impact the achievement of the government policy in short and medium to long term?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bu Tasha, for the opportunity. So first of all, I would like to appreciate Pak Ferry and team from the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs, who already collaborates with World Bank to provide the database for the NTMs. As we know that currently Indonesia already have to develop the long-term development plan, medium-term development plan, and also annual work plan for 2024. So exports becomes one of the main priority for Indonesia. We have the vision 2045 to become the 5th largest GDP economy in the world, and export should be support to have moved from the natural resources exports to the manufacturing sectors. And then we have to improve the value added from the goods and services, and to have the innovation. And afterwards, Indonesia will become the 10th exporters in the world. So the NTM is becoming important. As we know that before we move to discuss about Indonesia, actually the NTM, as mentioned by Pak Ferry, that in the global trends, NTMs becomes one of the policies did by all of governments. And we see that if we compare Indonesia with other countries, like developing countries in Vietnam and also with China, Indonesia is relatively not implemented a high non-tariff measures to compare to China and Vietnam. And China and Vietnam apply NTM through the technical barriers trade and also agricultural, industrial, and natural resources sectors, while Indonesia implementing NTM through quantity restriction and TBT. And if we compare to the developed countries, also, we see that the developed countries, most of developed countries also apply NTM. The highest one is the Netherlands, based on the data, the European Union, and then USA, Japan, and Australia also apply NTM through the technical barriers, trade follows by quantity and export measures. It means that in the future, because the low tariff barriers, the low tariff, there will be no tariff in the future because of the market integration and also most of the agreement between countries, bilateral, multilateral, or the regional. So it means that if we would like to support the export itself, we have to improve our productivity in our countries. One of the ways is by having the strategy to export the manufacturing products, and also by having the strategy to be part of the global value chains. So by having that kind of the policies in the futures to improve the productivity of our countries, we have to be aware about how to balancing the exports and imports, because imports also important for Indonesia if the imports for the raw materials and also capitals for the exporters. And besides that, in the strategy, as I mentioned before, that the strategy in our annual work plan 2023, when we would like to improve our economy around 5.3 until 5.5% in 2023, the export should be improved around 5.3 until 6.6%. The export should be manufacturing products by having trade promotion, strengthening export information through integration of export information and intelligence services, redesign the export education and training programs. While we have to also become part of the global value chain, prepare the ecosystem, facilitate producer SMEs, strengthening the domestic connectivity and logistics for exports. But if we would like to have export as a prime mover, we have to internalize the programs not only to the policymakers but also to the business actors. Currently, only 80% of the medium-large companies in Indonesia have export-oriented. And in Indonesia itself, the government should internalize the outward-looking policy by providing the openness, human resources, infrastructure, institution, business climate, and strengthening the research and development. So that's why government will ensure to make a balance between the foreign trade policy and domestic trade policy to protect the consumers by ensure that the trade runs smoothly, ensuring the ease of doing business, healthy competitive climate, facilitating accessible information and market access, and encourage R&D and supportive climate. And for the non-tariff measures database is very important because by having the non-tariff measure database that already provided by Kemenko Perekonomian and World Bank, we can give more good climate for businesses, that we are become more transparent, consistent with the international organizations regulation, becomes the economy become efficient and effective to support the businesses. So I think to wrap up all of my point of view, actually governments already want to make it balance between the policy and also the export and import policy with the protection for the consumer and the economy. Pak Iskandar can also elaborate more, but when we decide about the policy in trade, it's not only policy from one stakeholders, one ministry, but we also encourage the governance when we put the policy of trade. We invite all of the stakeholders, the private sectors, that can have an impact on the affected by the policy, by having like a public gathering or public dialogue. And then when we formulate the policy itself, we have tim pertimbangan kepentingan nasional. So that's consists of all of government from all of sectors. So we will consider the impact to other sectors and to others, to the other up or downstream industry, the economy as a whole, and then the welfare of the economy. So that's the governance from the policy that government try to make it balance between the policy for trade and policy for the economy as a whole. Besides that, I think the important things from the non-tariff measures, the trends for the futures, because we cannot avoid that the non-tariff measures will be increased, might be in the future, because there will be a zero tariff between countries. So the producer itself should improve their performance. They also have provide a capacity building for them. And then the consumer itself should more educated about the goods and services that they will use by them. So it is very important, because the literacy rate from the consumers about the safety of the goods and services should be improved in Indonesia. So maybe that's from our side. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bu Laksmi. Yeah, okay. So it's a very good message that right now we're balancing, we're trying to balancing or actually already doing the balancing of the foreign trade policy, and then the domestic or the economy as a whole. Yeah, and then that's make me have to go to Pak Iskandar as from the Ministry of Trade, who actually the executing agency for the trade policy. And the same question, Pa, how to strike the right balance between achieving legitimate public goals and avoid to unnecessarily distort trade, especially from the Ministry of Trade, especially from Pak Iskandar, who also have a lot of experience doing the trade negotiation. Please.
Thank you, Bu Tasya. First of all, I would like to extend my appreciation for inviting us from the coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs, Pak Deputy, as well as from the World Bank. I'm honored to be here. Second, I would like to extend my appreciation also to Ibu Angela, who has already presented a great presentation, very informative. And to us, Bu Moderator, actually I'm preparing my views regard to my response with the team. So integration of the global economy through successive rounds of multilateral trade negotiations resulted in a significant lower tariff rates over the past decades, as the long-term trend for tariff rates has been downward. NTMs have risen in their place. NTMs are widely used by developed countries compared to developing countries. I think Bu Lasmi also has already extended her view. In addition, the most widely used types of NTMs are technical barriers to trade and sanitary and phytosanitary measures. As we know, by definition, NTMs are policy measures other than ordinary custom tariffs that can potentially have an economic effect on international trade in goods, changing quantities traded or prices or both. NTMs are a neutral concept and doesn't necessarily imply a particular direction of impact. It is different to the term of non-tariff barriers, NTB, that has a protectionist or discriminatory intent. However, many studies have concluded that NTM measures increase the trade costs. Trade costs indeed can be reduced whenever possible, but not possible always to eliminate the regulation that originated them. So I guess what Ibu Angela has already presented give the a real fact of Indonesian case on this view. As we all know that Indonesia has ratified the WTO provision in Law number 7 1994, as well as other international agreements. So it has consequences for Indonesia obligation and rights, particularly in formulating the domestic rules that are consistent with international rules and commitments. We also know that WTO agreement basically contains the multilateral trading system principles, that is trade without discrimination, MFN and national treatment, fair trade, predictability, and promoting fair competition. However, it is also mentioned general exceptions which recognize WTO members' right to implement measures in order to achieve legitimate policy objectives, such as the protection of human health and safety and protection of the environment. I think this is also well explained by Angela. Each WTO member has a policy space to formulate its domestic policies, which can be utilized to encourage its domestic economic growth and people welfare without violating international commitments. Now, NTMs are considered problematic if they breach the key principles of WTO rules. For example, discriminating against imports and not necessary to achieve a non-trade objective and likely to impose significant costs on imports. In some cases, NTM's measures may be poorly designed and unintentionally hurt key sectors of the economy. So by that understanding, moderator, to avoid unnecessarily restrictive trade policies, Indonesia has always tried to implement the principles of good governance. And there are some existing practices I would like to share to show that the Ministry of Trade of Indonesia conducts an approach on ensuring the implementation of the principle of good government. First of all, Ministry of Trade of Indonesia has started to conduct regulatory impact assessment, RIA, as a systematic mechanism to ensure that the existing regulation meet the intended policy objectives and remain relevant. So here, for your information, that our agency for trade policy, the Ministry of Trade, conduct a role to do such assessment, analyze, to do RIA for all regulation that would be issued under the Ministry of Trade. So it is expected that the regulation issued will address their original and relevant objectives and not to add any trade costs and hamper the national economic development. I would like to add also to ensure that trade regulation comply with the provisions and commitments of any international trade agreements committed by Indonesia. Ministry of Trade has developed a mechanism to conduct compliance tests. So by this mechanism, we expect that all related regulation developed under the Ministry of Trade will be assessed with all the prevailing relevant provision of those trade agreements. Indonesia also has been a strong proponent on negotiating principles and provision on disciplines of ensuring non-restrictiveness trade policy in every its trade agreement negotiations. So some of those negotiating agreements have already concluded and ratified as well as implemented. So the last one I would like to among the action has been implemented by the Ministry of Trade is I think also already mentioned by Bu Lasmi that good regulatory practice principles are also applied in the trade remedy policies business process, which ensure transparency and predictability by providing information about the investigation, involve stakeholders by holding public hearing during the investigations, and consider the national interest by conducting impact assessment before the implementation of trade remedies. And this is all discussed by all relevant ministries, very hard actually, to issue trade remedy policies because would be different views from among related offices and stakeholders. But this is the idea of how to implement the regulatory practice process in all those policy making. So by this, Ibu Moderator, again, we welcome this launching. I would like to extend on behalf of Pak Kasan to appreciate and support the launching because our agency is related to the analysis and giving recommendation on the trade issues. Then I see that this database would be very useful for our agency. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Iskandar. And and from your explanation of your view that the MOT already have all the initiative, yeah, Pak, yeah, to we want to promote the good governance, as Bu Laksmi already also mentioned about the transparency and how this anti-M data set maybe built from that spirit, right? So I'm gonna go to Pak Ralph. The most I think you're the most important. I think you're the most important. You're the most important person here because I see that today's event cannot be held without the presence of the NTM database itself that already been produced by UNCTAD with an area, of course. I think representation from area also here. So I will give an opportunity for you, Pak Ralph, to give your view. And also my question is on the data set as this NTM data set as a policy public good, how can it be used to inform the public on Indonesia's trade policy, and how can it be updated regularly? Can it be used as an example for another country? Please, Pak.
Thank you very much. I don't think I'm the most important guest here because we have the representatives from the government of Indonesia. Without them, it wouldn't happen. And from the World Bank. So I think you did an extraordinary work here to put together this database. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And I had to look it up in my schedule, but I haven't traveled for 2.5 years on a long-haul business travel. And the last one was to Indonesia. So we had a workshop in 2019 together with the Ministry of Trade. And the Minister of Trade was there, as well as several ministers from line ministries on non-tariff measures and good regulatory practices. And now, after 2.5 years, it's my first travel on a long-haul business travel. So I have a special relation to Indonesia, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here. Before I get to answer your questions, I think there is a short video with my director saying a few words. So if you want to show that now.
Good morning to the representatives of the government of Indonesia. Good morning to the representative of the World Bank office in Indonesia. Good morning to the distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to say a few words at this data launch event where we unveil the latest updates on the non-tariff measures data of Indonesia. As the acting director of the Division of International Trade and Commodities of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, I am thrilled to hear about the great collaborative efforts by the World Bank and the government of Indonesia. During 2015 and 2018, UNCTAD, together with the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia and the government of Indonesia, collected and updated for the first time data on trade-related regulations in all ASEAN countries. Indonesia was among the very first Asian countries where data was collected systematically using the International Classification of Non-Tariff Measures that was developed by UNCTAD, the World Bank, and other partners. This was a major step towards regional integration in ASEAN since non-tariff measures became major obstacles to trade, and at the same time, most of them are very important regulations to protect health, safety, and the environment. This updated data would be useful for policymakers, businesses, and researchers to gain insights into Indonesia's trade and investment landscape. It will provide a comprehensive picture of the regulatory environment and help transparency and identify potential challenges. This in turn will help trade and investment promotion and sustainable economic growth. Once again, I want to express my sincere gratitude to the World Bank and the government of Indonesia for their dedication in collecting and updating this data. The transparency in trade is a global effort and needs all support. I would also like to thank all the stakeholders who have contributed to this project for their valuable inputs and feedback. I believe that this launch event marks a significant milestone in strengthening Indonesia's trade competitiveness and fostering economic growth. Thank you all for your participation, and I hope this event will be informative and insightful for everyone. Thank you.
So that was the Director of Trade from UNCTAD. To answer your questions, I would like to make 3 points. The first point is non-tariff measures are very important, and governments should not be shy to be transparent about their non-tariff measures. I wanted to make the point how important it is and how I prepare for my travel. For example, I check whether carpets are non-flammable, and Indonesia has regulations on this, so we can be all very safe here. I drink the mineral water because I know Indonesia has many SPS regulations on mineral water, so it's all very safe. And Angela gave us very, very nice examples of how important it is for consumers to have these non-tariff measures. Indeed, 80% of the non-tariff measures are so-called technical measures, so they are here to protect health, safety, and the environment. So even though the term non-tariff measures is very boring and can be seen as getting into a very serious and boring discussion, the content is not. It is actually very, very, impacting our daily life everywhere. We mapped all the non-tariff measures globally together with my colleagues in UN SCAP to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we found that 40% of NTMs are directly and positively linked to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So we see here that they have a very important function. Why some governments are still a little bit hesitating to be so transparent. I don't know, because there is actually no reason, as has been mentioned here. Developed countries have many non-tariff measures. In fact, they are very important to protect their consumers and their population. So there's no reason to be not transparent about this. But there is still a huge lack of transparency on non-tariff measures that we see globally. So we have collected the information for many countries now, 140 countries, covering 95% of world trade. But the challenge is now to regularly update this information. So that's my first point. My second point is that getting the information and collecting the non-tariff measures is really a painful exercise. And I congratulate the World Bank here for their effort here. Let me give you the example of China, where we also collected the information a few years back. So there we have identified 75 agencies, ministries, and standard-setting agencies that issue regulations. So we have to go around and find and make sure that we find all the agencies that issue regulations: Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, and so on. So that is the first really challenging exercise. Then we have to read all the regulations that these agencies issue, and we have to identify out of those regulations those that can have a potential impact on trade, as the definition was just given of non-tariff measures. So that's the first challenge. Then the next challenge is to use this information and to classify it according to this international classification of non-tariff measures, which we have developed together with the World Bank, with the OECD, and 5 other international organizations, as well as country representatives. So it became a common knowledge globally when we talk about non-tariff measures. So that was very important to have really here a international standard to collect this information and to map this information, because the Indonesian government, as well as exporters, they want to know what are the requirements if I want to export to Australia, where we currently update the data. What are the requirements when we export to Switzerland, because they have a new agreement with the EFTA countries between Indonesia and these countries. So it is very important that we have comparable data globally here to ease the access to this information for the governments, for researchers, and traders. So I think here we can use this as a very good example, the effort by the government of Indonesia and the World Bank globally, because we have developed this international standard with a wide range of international agencies. And now it has to be brought into life in every single country. And having this joint effort by the World Bank together with the government of Indonesia is a very good example, and I hope it will follow in many other countries. My third point is how important this information is. So we have heard and seen some numbers that it increases the trade costs, so maybe on average 20% or so. But this is just an average number. For many exporters, it is prohibitively high, because if you are a small producer of, say, agricultural products in Indonesia, it is impossible for you to export to the United States. The information for the United States, it's all there, even in one single repository. It's the Code of Federal Regulation. This has hundreds of thousands of pages, literally. We read them all, and we coded it following this international classification, because if you are a small exporter and you export, say, mangoes, there may be regulations for mangoes, for fruits, for agricultural products, for all products, and you cannot just look for mangoes, because you have to also look for fruits, for agricultural products, and so on. So it would be impossible without a systematic approach, a systematic database to provide the information for exporters in countries. The big companies, they have often their ways. They have a lot of experience with this. They hire law firms to find out the requirements in the export markets, but that's not an option for small and medium-sized enterprises. So it's very important to have this information. There are three beneficiary groups here. One is researchers, and that's very important because we need to understand what are the most burdensome regulations, and that has been the point has been made in the presentation that we saw earlier, that there are some regulations that are maybe more burdensome. They cannot just be eliminated because maybe these are very important. So we always have to look at the costs and the benefits of those regulations. So cost-benefit comparison is very important here. But it is very important to know which are the most burdensome regulations. And also what we know from research is that several groups are disproportionately affected. So poorer regions, remote regions are disproportionately negatively affected by non-tariff measures. There is an impact on smaller companies. So bigger companies actually don't find it so difficult to comply with the regulations, but it's the smaller companies. And as we want to have sustainable growth in countries, we also need to have medium-sized enterprises being engaged in international trade. So they are disproportionately affected. Very important also in terms of competitiveness, what we know from research, that it's not only the non-tariff measures in the export markets that matter. Of course, if you want to export palm oil, say, you have to comply with all the regulations in the European Union, in Switzerland, and so on. But it also matters what are your own regulations in your country. We have heard this also for the imports because producers need to have high quality, low price input products to process them and then to export. But also what matters is if the regulations that are in place in one country are somewhat similar to the regulations in the export markets, then producers find it much easier to export. So if the regulations in Indonesia, say, are based on international standards that are ideally also used by Australia, then that would be easier for the Indonesian exporters to export to Australia. So regulatory cooperation is very important. Being active in standard setting organizations like Codex Alimentarius, which develops international standards on food security. So this is a very important component here. Researchers are very important. The government are a major beneficiary of this database for at least two reasons. One is coordination inside the government. And here I'm not citing someone from Indonesia, but I would like to cite a government official from New Zealand, which is a relatively small, well-organized country. And when we collected the first time the information systematically in New Zealand, the New Zealand government said, well, this is excellent. It's the first time that we see ourselves all the regulations coming from all these different agencies in our own country. So coordinating inside, because there may be regulations that overlap between the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Agriculture. And so our data collection approach provides a very systematic approach to this. The second reason is, as I mentioned, regulatory cooperation. Within ASEAN, for example, it's good if regulations are somehow similar. I know this is politically very sensitive, very difficult, but it's good to make an effort here to bring in line somehow the regulations by mutual recognition, equality requirements, and so on. So this is a major beneficiary, the governments. And ultimately, it's the private sector who does the trading. So it is the traders that benefit from this. As I gave the example of the United States, the information is there about their regulations, but it would be impossible if there is no systematic mapping of this one. So traders come from their product. They are not interested in what are all the SPS or TBT regulations in one country. They are interested what are the regulations for tomatoes, for palm oil, for textile products in the country I want to export to. So they come from the product side. So it's very important we have this database available in a very systematic way, which then provides the information. So I hope I answered your questions. The information for the public is very important. I mentioned these 3 groups. How can this information be updated? Well, that's a major challenge. As I just said, we have the information for many countries now. The challenge is how to regularly update this. And here, I would like to encourage the government of Indonesia to continue its effort. We have a cooperation with some governments that give us the information. So they provide us with the regulations. They even provide us with the product codes that these regulations apply to. So that makes our efforts in updating the database quite easy. Some other countries, they give us the regulations that often matches with notification requirements to the WTO. Not all regulations need to be notified to WTO. For example, if they are based on international standards, we would still have it in our database. It would not necessarily have to be notified to WTO. So there is not a one-to-one map. But this helps us already if we get the regulations, and then the coding of NTMs and HS, we can do it then on our side. And then there are some countries where we do not yet have such a close collaboration, where we update the data from time to time, but that's not ideal. So we would like to engage more and more the governments, and I'm very pleased that this has worked out here in Indonesia. So in that sense, I think the Indonesia case can be used as a very good example globally to increase the transparency in trade. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Pak Ralph. Yeah, it's a very comprehensive explanation, yeah, Pak, on how you emphasize the importance of the NTM, but also see that it's a very hard work, yeah, to collect all of those data and then make it can be comparable globally, and also how this information can be important, especially for us here, the government and the researcher, and also the private sector, and on how the data is then can be updated. I will go to Pak Max, actually. I mean, the effort to and then we have this extended database of Indonesia's NTM to expand the data set for Indonesia. So now we have updated until the December, from 2008 until the December 2021. I mean, you also the one who started this initiative, and then why do you think it was important to do it, right? And then yeah, maybe you can also inform us how it can be used to inform the public on Indonesia's trade policy when you start all of this. Yes, Pak Max.
Ya, terima kasih Bu. Selamat siang semua, Bu-bu, Bapak-bapak. Dulu saya mau terima kasih organizer untuk mengundang saya hari ini. Saya senang sekali untuk kembali ke Indonesia. Saya tinggal di sini 6 tahun. Setelah 2 tahun saya bisa melihat banyak perubahan. Tapi one thing that does not change, actually a couple of things that do not change in Indonesia are macet, as you have all experienced this morning again, and also the willingness of the Indonesian government to move the policy agenda forward. And I'm very pleased to see my old friend, can I say Uncle Paferi? Or brother, because I'm uncle, you're uncle, brother. No, and many other government officials here who really have been, are courageous enough to move this agenda forward by being very transparent, which is, as other panelists have mentioned, is not granted, but it is very important. And this is, a great example of that transparency, the launch today. And I want to answer your question by making 3 points, talking about why this is, I think, a big deal. This data, why, how can the data perhaps can be used, maybe complementing the excellent points that have been made before, and then who could use this data for policymaking. So the first point is really congratulating the team of the World Bank colleagues. There are so many people that have been mentioned in passing. I want to mention them, if you allow me, without the boo and without the mas and ba, just to save time. But obviously, Angela and Silla, who are now leading the effort, but, Pasha, Bayo, Agnes, Wisnu, Nabil, Azmi, Dani, Yana, Lamia, Alfa, they all contributed to different extent to this. So it was really a huge collective effort together with the government of Indonesia. So that's really, I think, the first point to highlight. And I think there are really a lot of great features in this data. But I want to highlight two as an example of why I think this data is important. The first one is that this data can help unpack this black box of NTMs for analytical purposes. So I think this has been one of the main reasons why there has been so little analytical, rigorous work on the impacts of NTMs, right? So this is very different to import tariffs, right? You can open any trade policy journal, any trade policy discussion. They will still be dominated by import tariffs. But import tariffs, as Ibu Lakshmi and Pa Iskandar have mentioned, we know import tariffs are not the future of trade policy. In fact, they are not even the present of trade policy, because trade policy now is dominated by non-tariff measures. Now, and that goes back to Ralph's point. One of the reasons why non-tariff measures have not been studied is because they are boring. There are 89 individual measures that fulfill very boring but absolutely crucial role. And researchers and policymakers and advisors and trade analysts have preferred to kind of go back to the safety of import tariffs, where you have only one measure, it's quantifiable, it's very easy to understand, it just increases the price by a percentage of the value of the import or export. Now, here it's a very different territory. And so what would the policymaker, what kind of paper should a policymaker read to design a trade, like a non-tariff measures, right? To design its trade policy today. He has plenty of papers on tariffs, but no, very few, I would say. I don't actually want to exaggerate, but there are not as many, not quite as many and so part of the reason is really this, for this lack of evidence, is the lack of data. And this data set, I think, really tries to open up this black box by codifying individual measures, at every point in time for every product, and even allowing for providing a quantitative dimension, as Angela mentioned, by allowing this estimation of this ad valorem equivalent. And so I think that's the first point as to why this is important. The second point, the second example of why this is important is because it adds this time dimension to the data. And, UNCTAD has done a really amazing work in kind of trying to standardize and bring out this data across countries. But this is a stock-taking exercise at one point in time. To where this data, overcomes that is that it brings this time dimension. So it really shows what changes in every month that has happened. And this is crucial if you want to get the impact of these things right. The time dimension, measuring how imports and export response to the change, I think, is important. So I really hope that this effort can be replicated in other countries. It takes a village, as you have heard, to actually build this, but I think it's one of those investments with high returns. Now, how can the data then be used, to go back to your other questions. I see at least three roles of this data, and I'm kind of repeating what other people are saying and perhaps adding my own experience in terms of example. I think the first role is monitoring NTMs, and this is important because by monitoring it, you can actually assess the policy coherence of NTMs, right? So is one measure meant to, let's say, protect the environment or protect consumer, really taking into account then the other spillover effect of that measure on other policy objectives of the government, such as improving export competitiveness. So, is this measure applied to an input which is crucial for a lot of the exports of the country, for example? Are they in line with WTO agreements, with the regional trade agreements, and other treaties that Indonesia has signed, right? So this is about coherence with the agreements and with the obligations that Indonesia already has. And also, are they actually fulfilling a legitimate objective? One of the things that I think the team learned from this exercise is to read and interpret the regulations according to this standard classification. And sometimes it was a bit puzzling because it wasn't clear really. I mean, there was a clear trade distortionary impact of specific regulation, but it was not entirely clear how that should be coded according to the standard classification, because maybe the objective wasn't really clear. So by doing that and by doing this exercise systematically, it can actually push, and that goes back to the point that government officials are making, can push the agencies to really think hard about whether this is necessary to achieve a legitimate policy objective. The second role, and again, this has been said, but I think it's important to reiterate, identifying reform opportunities. So what measures could be lifted, right? Obviously, the vast majority of these measures are trying to achieve a legitimate objective. Some measures, I would argue, could achieve the same objective, but in a different way. So actually, the same objective could be achieved without this measure. And I go back to the port of entry restriction. So in July 2012, Indonesia issued a port of entry restriction for fruits and vegetables imports that at that point could not enter Java through the port of Jakarta, could only enter Java through the port of Surabaya. And that produced, and we have looked into that, that has produced a spike in the price of fruits and vegetables in Jakarta. And some people might remember that. Now, the ostensive reason why that happened was that there was not a sufficient, like a quarantine facility of sufficiently high quality in the port of Jakarta. We're talking about a port that at that time was probably handling about 70% of international trade of Indonesia. So even if that was the case, I'm kind of I have a hard time thinking that investing in that facility in Jakarta port would not not have addressed that issue in a much more efficient way for the Indonesian economy than just forcing everyone to go through Surabaya. So I think but other measures are there and are necessary, most measures, in fact, but sometimes they can be improved. And this data can actually highlight very costly measures that perhaps can be a first indication of a measure that is there, fulfills a legitimate role, but you can actually administer in a more efficient way. Because maybe it is increasing the cost by 60%, so it could increase the cost by only 30%. I want to give a quick example of that. There is at that time I was here, and sorry, maybe this has changed, but there was an obligation for 100% inspection by quarantine inspection for certain goods, for certain agricultural goods. Now, with the risk-based assessment, this could actually be brought down, this share of inspection, without compromising the quality. There could be also the third point is how that this data could actually help assess the impact of reforms, and we have actually heard about that, and there are different ways of doing it. And I'm looking forward to the assessment of the impact of removing pre-shipment inspections that has been mentioned before, this fall of pre-shipment inspection, as that helped, for example, exporters that used inputs that were subject to pre-shipment inspections to export more? I think that's a very interesting question that this data can help address. One thing the data cannot do, and I think it's very important to recognize this limitation, is to quantify the benefits of NTMs unless these benefits are captured by the increase in demand for the good. But otherwise, addressing the externality of, okay, I'm protecting consumers from health and from diseases, how much does that value? That's something that cannot be addressed. I just want to then finish 1 minute on who could use the data, and then just kind of a bit of thinking out loud here. But I think this data, as was mentioned, it's a great opportunity to enhance a coordination mechanism. These NTMs are obviously a cross-ministerial effort, and to the extent that the data helps a centralized institution, there is the example on the tariff side of Team Tariff in the Ministry of Finance, but to the extent that that can actually be replicated with an effective coordination mechanism within the government of Indonesia, I think this data can be a really valuable tool. Terima kasih banyak again, and happy to hear the other thoughts from Pak Kiki.
Okay, thank you, Pak Max. I want to emphasize on how the time dimension on this data is also a very important part, because we see that regulation is it's a dynamic thing. It's not a static, so everything could change, and somehow you also really highlight on fulfilling the legitimate objection, how some objective actually can be achieved with other measure. Maybe if we still have time, I want to have some comment on that too from Bu Laksmi or Pak Iskandar. But before that, we'll move on to our last panelist. I want to see I want to hear Pak Kiki's view on actually how this data set can be a tool to help improve the public policy. How can it be used to identify what measures to reform, and can it spur more policy research on NTM impacts by Indonesian and international researchers? Please, Pak.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate the World Bank to provide this very important and a game changer data set for Indonesia. And as a researcher that always use the WDI, World Development Indicators from the World Bank, also UNCTAD data, trade map, this data is really helpful for the researchers. So my quick comment, of course, this is helpful and useful, and then a game changer for the next research activities in Indonesia. But not to be overwhelmed, because I'm the last, and then we heard about so much information about the NTM. Let me just remind you for the another perspective using a cost of productions. As I start with the last slide that presented by the speaker, what's next? And then it mentions that export, investment promotions, economic transformation, and sustainable growth. Let me give you some perspective on the Indonesia economy. 20 years ago, Indonesia GDP per capita is, or GNI per capita, around $1,000 per capita per annum. And now it's about 4,000. So 4 times in 20 years. And that's the economic growth, just 5%. Now we aim to, like President himself, President Jokowi himself mentions that we need to achieve at least 7% economic growth in the next 20 years. What does it mean? It means 1.5. So 7 per 5 is 1.5. That means we need to be like 6 times higher, right? So 4,000 now, 20 years from now is 23,000, 24,000. 23,000.2 documented officially by the Bappenas, 2045. So meaning 6 times higher. So increase the economic from 1,000 to 4,000 4 times. From 4,000 to 23,000, 24,000, 6 times. So 1.5. So this 1.5 is a magic number, let's say. 5% to 7% economic growth, right? Open unemployment, for instance. If you see 1.5 for good and 2/3, the opposite for bad. So our open unemployment we try to achieve from 5% to 3%. And then let's make it more simple on the I-core. Indonesia has 35 or 34% saving rate. Why we only grow 5%? Because our I-core is 6.6 or 6 something. We need to improve by 2/3 to achieve I-core about 4 something. So if we can achieve that 4 something I-core, incremental capital output ratio, then we can achieve economic growth 7%, because 34% divided by 4.4, about 7%. Have Indonesia ever experienced this? Yes. In 1987 to 1992, the best period of Indonesia can have I-core, 4.4 efficiency. What does it mean? That means manufacturing. So let me put this NTM on the more on manufacturing side, because Indonesia need to grow 7%. So this database is very important to monitor Indonesia economy, to monitor Indonesia regulation, to monitor Indonesia policy, to not conflicting each other, to not overwhelm each other, to not counterproductive, and to not create blunder to Indonesia economy. That's the important things, because at least 13 government institutions involved in these NTMs. And according to area, 700 regulations, regulation that impact the NTM. And more than 7,000 products that affected by the NTM. So this is something very serious. And then from the World Bank also, I saw the slide, 600 something that affected, regulation that affected, produced by how many, I don't know, institution, government institution. So this is the most important thing. We need to achieve the I-core 4.4 that we experienced more than 30 years ago. Can we get it? Can we achieve it? Can Indonesia can get it? Yes, we can. We have experienced that. But the problem now, how? And this data is very important to identify that, and then monitor from that, and then do every part of it. So that's to give you some introductions. I would like to put on the table 7 principles that we need to have in Indonesia. Number 1, Indonesia aiming for the economic efficiency, cost of production. So what's next? What's next is NTM must provide us next for the researcher and other activities to see the impact to the cost of productions, to look at the intermediate inputs costs, the impact, because if we have intermediate input costs higher, then it will ruin our economy. I just want to remind you, just 10 years ago, from 2009 to 2014, you can see that average intermediate input tariff rate in Indonesia is higher than the final product. So what happened at that time? I believe you also heard so many complaints about Indonesia at that time, because the intermediate input cost increased, and then you can see clearly capital import decrease from that period. So why? Because we violate effective rate of protections. That the tariff from raw must be lower than intermediate, must be lower than the final. That the tariff rate for final is the highest. But what we do is the other way around. Intermediate input tariff higher than final products. So we need to avoid this unnecessary mistake or unintentional policy or mistake, that by looking at and using this data set, the NTMs. Number 2, we need to harmonize the policy. Again, manufacturing intermediate inputs are very important to be part of considerations of this using of the data. I don't want to say that consumptions like food and etc. Not important. That's important. But if you're talking about economic growth, the most important thing to me is manufacturing sector and intermediate inputs, the impact of the NTM to the intermediate inputs, cost of productions. We need to keep Indonesia in the economies of scale situations. If previous speaker, panelist from UCNTAD mentioned that New Zealand's quite shocked with the comprehensive simultaneous analysis. And not to mention Indonesia, New Zealand is number 1 in ease of doing business. Indonesia ranked 70 something. So we need a lot of efforts to do. And of course, outward-looking policy, FDI inflows, we have to be, like a downstreaming. Have you heard about it? I believe it's a hot issue in Indonesia at the moment. So when we are doing to the downstreaming, I think many NTMs are related to that. Yeah, one of the example, export ban, for instance. And then how it impacts Indonesia economy, how it impacts the world, how to balance between Indonesia and the world at the same time, because we need to accelerate economic growth, but we also have to consider other countries. Yeah, otherwise retaliations and will affect Indonesia economy as well. So we have to be careful of that. And last but not least, what I would like to remind us all that we need a comprehensive helicopter view and someone who stand on the balcony to look at those who dancer in the dancing floor, in the dance floor. No, what I would like to say is we have to avoid narcissism, ego sectoral, Indonesia said. So every government unit must understand what they doing on the policy will impact for trade, for current account, for capital account, for the investment. So we have to keep it harmonized, like you heard about the, very systematic dancing, very nice to see, very harmonized instrument, musics. Then that we need dirigent on that. And the dirigent, those who lead need data set and need researcher to echoing and to remind. And that's the data set is very important. And me and then my colleagues from the university, all University of Indonesia are ready to, work hand in hand with the World Bank, with international institution, to remind our government, because at the end of the day, we need to improve our ICOR and we need to increase our economy from 5% level to 7.5 at least percent level to achieve 23,000 to 24,000, 2045. And not to forget, in 2035, we need to avoid middle income trap before the end of democratic bonus. So this is very important. This is just first step. Let's go together and hand in hand. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Pak Kiki. Okay, please give a round of applause of all panelists. Do we still have time? Yeah, I still, maybe just, okay. Yeah, I will give an opportunity to give a chance to each one of you, maybe to comment on each other views. Maybe one thing on before I've already mentioned about how actually some objective actually can be achieved by other measure. So as Angela said that on his presentation that the NTMs need to be carefully designed, and that there is also a question from a participant that how we can eliminate an NTMs without really make the quality of the product decrease and something like that. Maybe from Pak Iskandar and Bu Laksmi.
Thank you, Bu Moderator. So actually, I have enjoyed the views from other panelists as well as, of course, the main presenter here, Angela. So I underline what Dr. Kiki just mentioned about the orchestrated move by the government. This is very important. Of course, as I mentioned, that the Ministry of Trade has already tried the best to formulate any regulation that are needed, and my agents also join with the assessment whether the main objectives of the regulation would be achieved by assessing and also by discussing with other relevant offices internally, and also would be extended externally to the other relevant ministries. But I underline also what the Dr. Kiki mentioned, that coordinating is very important. So then I guess in this forum, since the presentation mentions the NTMs are spread out in many ministries and other government offices, including the Ministry of Trade. So in my view, the role of coordinating ministry, Pak Deputy of Economic Affairs is very important here. And I know that, I think we all know that the coordinating ministry of Economic Affairs has already done this the best, but I think based on the views from Angela and also from all of us panelists here, underlining the importance of coordinations among the ministries. So in order to achieve the objective that is reviewed again by the Dr. Kiki, the growth of Indonesia, some percentage and ICOR that would be achieved, that has been clearly defined. But in order to achieve this, coordinating all by ministries are very important. And again, I would like to see this finding, this launching the data set of Indonesia NTMs also would be very good inputs, especially for my agency. And I'm looking forward to use this for some assessment needed to be discussed internally in the Ministry of Trade, and also would like also to extend this to the other ministries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bu Tasya, for the opportunity again. And I just want to complement what has been explained by Pa Iskandar. And also I want to echo what has been mentioned by all by other panelists. As I mentioned before, that we have a vision to become fifth largest economy in the world in 2045. And export should be boost to improve the economy. And as also mentioned by Pa Kiki, that we have to improve 6 times than the current conditions. And it means that we already have to know and indicate what kind of obstacles faced by the exporters. So two main problems faced by the exporters is the information about the standard itself when they want to export to the targeted countries. And besides that, they also has obstacles in having inputs for their production process letters. And the other one that already discussed by Pak Kiki and other panelists, that the coordinations, because the policy makers has their own issues on every sectors. And it means that if we would like to boost the export itself, we should have the same perspective about the outward looking. And this opportunity, it means that Indonesia should prepare the right ecosystem for the businesses and for the economy, so the economy and the businesses can improve their competition, the competitiveness in the global competition. And industry also can fulfill the international standards, have an access to the standard of required by other countries. And important things that are already developed by Kemenko and also World Bank, Ibu Angela and teams, that the NTM database become important because as mentioned by Pak Ralph and also Pak Max, okay, the NTMs is important to become a source of information, not only for the private sectors, but also for the government sectors, because the government itself can understand and calculate, monitors and access the policy that already conducted in Indonesia, and also can evaluate the cost from the NTM itself. So it means that by having that kind of comprehensive analysis, the Indonesian government can provide the right policy for the economy. And besides that, the NTM it should be transparent. That already mentioned by Pak Ralph and Pak Max, that don't be worried to become more transparent to the businesses or the economy, because it will create the business climate, good investment climate also. But we also have to improve our economy in domestics. We also have to have a strong research and development, and we also have to have more go to international standards. So it means that the product can be moved from one country to another country without restriction. And we also have to ensure that the policy, the trade policy, the NTM or other things, can truly encourage the safety and the welfare of the economy and not to hinder the trade. So maybe that's from our side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bu Laksmi. I think it's a very good message as a closing for this panel. How we all we know that we have a very ambitious target to reach, as Kiki mentioned, 7%, and how to do that, how to make sure we have the right policy to achieve that, the right strategy to achieve that, and productivity, how we can really utilize this NTM database to achieve those target, so it can be used to really as what we do as a team, enhancing the industrial competitiveness and boosting the export performance. Okay, thank you to you all. We're very sorry because the time is very limited. We really hope to have another discussion more with you. But for now, I think we have to end this session of our panel discussion. And then I will give it back to Sila. But please, one more round of applause to all our panelists.
Right, there we go. Thank you very much to our distinguished panelist, Ibu Tasya. And this now officially takes us to the end of our event here today, the grand launch of the Indonesian Non-Tarif Measures Database. We hope that you enjoyed this event as much as we did. And I'm sure you're now ready for another NTM joke, so we'll close here. In the meantime, we would like to invite you for a lunch that is now served here outside today. Thank you for your active participation, distinguished guests, panelists, and everyone here today. On behalf of the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs and the World Bank, thank you for joining us and hope to see you all soon today. Thank you.
Every day, Indonesian households consume thousands of products, and Indonesian firms use thousands of inputs to produce. Non-tariff measures, or NTMs, are policy measures that aim to ensure that these products and inputs are safe, healthy, they respect the environment, and do not pose other types of risk. Even as these measures aim to protect all Indonesians, they can also affect the economy. Complying with these measures can be costly, so they can result in higher prices for consumers, and they can make companies less internationally competitive. For example, the World Bank estimates that special packaging requirements on leather, textiles, and apparel products increase the cost of these products in Indonesia by 26%. So the government needs to design NTMs that achieve their objectives without imposing excessive economic costs. For that, governments need comprehensive and up-to-date data. As part of its engagement with the Indonesian government, the World Bank has produced this type of data on non-tariff measures for Indonesia. This is the most comprehensive data on NTMs available in any country worldwide. It gives information on all NTMs applied by Indonesia every month on every product, and it is updated every year. The data allows the government, researchers, NGOs, and the general public to know what NTMs are applied to what products and at what costs. This can help design better NTMs for the need of the Indonesian people and the economy. The dataset, along with its manual and usage examples, are available on the World Bank Development Data Hub, the UNCTAD Trade Analysis Information System trains, and on the World Integrated Trade Solution.